So we welcome those who work together on the way of the journey. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kong, for providing the very detailed, the presentation is very informative. The similar, may I see the hands if anyone would like to raise any clarifying questions. As I mentioned, that we'll have the open discussions. Yes, can we have the microphone?
Thank you for your well presentation about the climate change adaptation in Korea. So you mentioned about the conducting research on the climate change adaptation. So my question is very simple. What kind of research in which field you are conducting? And the second question is, I would like to share, or could you share some significant experience from your research on climate change adaptation activities? Thank you.
Before I give it to Dr. Kong, I think the questions that you are asking, we can park that because this is more on a general in nature, and we can put that to respond during the open the questions and the answer session. If it's okay with you, I'd like to request Dr. Kong to make this is 5 minutes, the brief remarks, what has been said, and I understand that he has 2-3 slides also to show.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ho Jung-gang from Yonsei University, and I'm an ecologist. I've worked on effects of climate change on ecosystems, including wetlands, tundra, and subtropical peatland as well. But today I'm going to talk about 2 issues, and one is to introduce the research center that I'm involved in now, and secondly, I'd like to make several questions or suggestions on the previous presentation. So this slide shows the overview on the green infrastructure technology for climate change, which is conducted at Yonsei University now. This is funded by Ministry of Education, Science and Technology, and currently 10 professors from 6 universities are working on it. So as you can see in this slide, we have 3 big areas, and the first one is more about the management and overarching issues to produce climate scenario and design hydraulic quantity. And using all the information from the other studies, we'd like to produce some adaptation scenarios. And the area 2 is the main core researching field, which includes concrete, foundation, slopes, road, and structural analysis. So that covers the main issues in the civil engineering perspectives, which I'm going to go in details in the next slide. And the third issue is about water resources, and we are looking at 2 sub-disciplines. One is about urban structure, and the second one is coastal issues. And looking into the second areas, these are the key technologies that we are working on now. The first one is about disaster predictions for natural slopes. And the second one is adaptive geotechnical designing. And the third one is concrete for extreme weather, such as extremely hot or extremely cold areas. And fourthly, we are looking at slimming technology by applying the structural analysis that is used by many civil engineers. And finally, one professor is looking into the porous pavement technology. So actually this center was started last year, so it's fairly new to us. And the previous research is mostly focused on mitigation technologies, but now we are moving into adaptation technologies. So that's the introduction of the research center that I'm working on now. And the final issue is about several suggestions or actually the difficulties and problems that I'm facing from a researcher's perspective in relation to climate change adaptation issues. There are a lot of specified researches surrounding Korea. Actually, I have reviewed literature review, the research is underway now, and actually there are several hundred of research underway funded by the government, of which size is around 0.1 million US dollar per annum, so it's a fairly good size. So there are a lot of studies underway, and most of them are government-led R&D, so professors or some research institute are supported by the taxpayers' money. But finally, actually, there are a separation of stakeholders, or I would say barriers among different ministries. I'd like to tell you about one example of myself. And I once worked on the coastal wetland restoration project, which was funded by the Ministry of Education and Science and Technology. But I was partially funded by the Ministry of Environment. But because it's a coastal wetland, actually it's an issue of Ministry of Construction, Transport, and Maritime. And the area includes actually agricultural land. So it's another issue of Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry. So, some say everybody's responsibility is nobody's responsibility, and that's kind of problems that I'm facing during my work. So I'd like to suggest, or probably we have to solve these problems and to have a control tower and data hub where we could dig up all the information that already gathered or are under gathering now. So I believe KACCC could be the place to take care of it. And eventually, or at the end of the day, we need some sort of industry need-based research and R&D. Otherwise, the governmental-led R&D could not be sustainable. So, and finally, we need a no-boundary cooperation in relation to the issues. So I believe this conference would be a good venue to find another cooperators for future researches in my field. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kong, for making the very last point, and that's actually a very good migrating from Kong to Eric is basically when you mentioned this, the research challenges, and the Eric is from the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is primarily focusing on the research. So Eric, floor is for you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for that segue, although, in fact, I'm not going to talk about SEI's research. I just wanted to respond a little bit to what people said. It seems to me from these presentations that South Korea is following many best practices, focusing on both mitigation as a first component of adaptation, as was raised earlier, and adaptation with substantial targeted greenhouse gas emission reductions. Adaptation plans are based on the most up-to-date emission scenarios and take into account the needs of different sectors and the needs of vulnerable people. The plan is in law and takes uncertainty into consideration through a rolling 5-year plan. It seems to me that we can all learn a great deal. We've been asking in this forum already for examples to consider, and we can learn a great deal from South Korea, the host country of this forum. In that spirit, I have 3 questions for the presenters. It was suggested in yesterday's closing plenary that we try many different approaches because not everything will work. It seems that South Korea is indeed trying many different approaches for adaptation. How do you deal with the possibility that some of these may not succeed? That is, what are the processes for learning and taking into account the cost that may lead to something that does not actually achieve the adaptation that was intended? And all the questions are about uncertainty, really. As the first speaker noted, the ESRA's climate scenarios are now superseded, and the temperatures from the new scenarios in 2050 are higher. The next update won't be available for many years, and it is also that result may also result in higher temperatures or lower temperatures, and actual experience temperatures, sea level rise, precipitation, storm frequency, etc., may be different than what's anticipated. So how do you deal with that uncertainty? Along with that one, part of that same question for monitoring and evaluation, how do you monitor and evaluate when you've got projects of 30 years or 100 years, a topic that was raised yesterday and today? And my final question, I must ask, as a citizen in a country with many climate skeptics, do you have any climate skeptics who have a strong political influence? If not, why do you think that's the case? And if you do, how do you address skepticism when you're seeking support for costly measures to deal with uncertain impacts? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric, for the questions. And let me just end the reflection from our last speaker in the panel, and then probably any of the panel speaker from the Korean who has the experiences will take the questions and respond, in addition to what I'm going to ask the floor to raise any questions. But before that, it's my pleasure to request Mr. Ong to say the words or the reflection on the presentation like what Eric did.
Thank you, Chair. As the last panel speaker, let me begin with reasons why adaptation has received less attention than mitigation in South Korea, similar to other countries. From my perspective, and Mr. Seo has already mentioned, this may be due to uncertainties in climate change science. Scientific uncertainty may be a greater problem for adaptation policy than mitigation policy, because climate change impacts will remain difficult to predict, particularly at the local and regional levels, that may be most directly relevant to adaptation. And the differences are also evident in the overall goal of mitigation and adaptation policy. The goal of mitigation policy is easily quantified, while the metrics for measuring success in adaptation are not as clear. This is closely related to the more tangible nature of mitigation actions compared with the less defined actions on adaptation. As already mentioned in the presentations made by Mr. Seo and Dr. Kwon, Korea established the National Adaptation Strategy in 2010 and started to communicate with local governments. In 2011, local governments started to formulate their own adaptation plan, and now they are in progress. In terms of cross-sectoral governance, Korea set up a national government adaptation committee with 13 ministries to implement the national adaptation strategy. It seems that everything is well arranged and prepared. However, to implement adaptation strategies more effectively, government and local authorities should recognize and tackle certain issues they are currently facing. First of all, coordination and cross-sectoral governance has been often inhibited by political rivalries between ministries and agencies. This includes the silo effect, where adaptation is seen as a departmental rather than a corporate issue. The range of collaborations in adaptation planning can provoke tensions emerging from organizational rivalry, create policy overlaps between departments, problems of communication and coordination. Therefore, there is an urgent need for a new governing structure and better coordination to implement adaptation strategies more effectively. Secondly, there is little consideration for vulnerable people in the adaptation planning, particularly projects that address the effect of climate change on health and income of vulnerable households have weak representation in South Korea. In Korea, vulnerable people may be categorized into four groups. These are urban poor, rural communities, outdoor workers, and the last group, children, isolated elderly people, persons with disabilities, and people with language barriers. It is important to recognize that climate change is no longer just about changing temperatures and rainfall patterns. It is also about human rights. If we want to give climate change a human face, more attention should be paid for vulnerable regions and groups. Another major challenge to climate change adaptation is the fact that the South Korean government structure is highly centralized. Highly centralized systems also means weak local adaptation capacity, as local governments await direction and budgetary resources from above. In the case of South Korea, this has meant a focus on infrastructure and engineering measures, which result in relatively little attention to public participation in adaptation awareness, education, and planning. Therefore, in an effort to give more responsibility and resources to local government and civil society, communication should be improved to ensure information flow to citizens and key stakeholders. Lastly, the progress and effectiveness of adaptation policies needs to be continuously reviewed by identifying the critical gaps between increasing knowledge of adaptation challenges and actual implementation. One such example for Korea is the requirement for all major government departments to produce their respective departmental adaptation plans. In closing, I would like to emphasize that we cannot fight this battle alone. In partnership with the other regions of the world, we have to develop a strong network to increase our capabilities in adapting to a changing world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for highlighting what's need to be done in future to improve or enhance the plan. Now, I already have half a dozen of the questions altogether, but I'd like to see the hand so that we can capture at least one or two from the floor, and then I would like to give the panelists to respond. Okay, we have the two hands. One is at the back and one is in the middle.
I have two questions. The first one is for Dr. Han. Maybe detail we could discuss bilaterally, but still I'm really interested to know a little bit more about capacity building components. As you rightly highlighted, capacity building activities are being run, whether it is country focused or how it is being organized. So probably it would be nice to know a little bit more, but detail we can have bilateral sharing. And my second question would be any of panel member, when we say monitoring to climate change impact or adaptation, then what kind of monitoring indicators we have developed, since it really requires long-term kind of approach. So how we really ensure that all the indicators are really contributing for that. If I could hear from any of you, since investment has been made to really come up with some steps or some kind of indicators as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Someone raised in the middle.
Thank you. My name is Pauline from the Cambodia. I'm working for the Church Aid, Christian Aid Cambodia. I have a very short question regarding the research. Because as your presentation, which is about the research from the government side, and in some countries there are both like the independent or civil society research institutes and also the government. So in this regard, I would like to know if your research result or finding would be contradict to the research by like NGO or other independent institutions. And I think that in some cases, you know, the research finding may be biased to the civil society or to the government. So in your case, is there any challenging issues on this? Thank you.